Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday evening Bible study as we're looking at John's Gospel. We're certainly very blessed to have you join us tonight. We do have some people from Bethlehem here live as well. If you're joining us via the live stream, I'd invite you to scroll down just a little bit and pull up the lesson from 2 weeks ago. It's the Request of the Greeks, part 2. We're going to be picking up there with John 12, verse 30. There is a new lesson posted tonight which will bring this little section of John 12 to a close. Whether we get to that or not tonight or not, I'm not sure, but it's there and available in case we do. So again, the plan for tonight is to pick up where we left off last week with John 12, verse 30, which is page 3 of the document that we had pulled up last week. Well, let's begin our study with prayers. We pray. Lord God of perfect grace, mercy, and peace, you are always more eager to give your blessings than we are to receive them. And so we ask that you would be with us this evening as we study your word, that you would open our eyes to see wonderful things in that word, and that you would strengthen and build our faith in the Son of God who lived, died, and rose again for us. We ask this in all things in his holy name. Amen. Okay, so just maybe a really brief, I'm not going to go very far back at all, but just go back one little paragraph, which is verse 27, I guess 2 little paragraphs, 27, where Jesus has these 2 prayers. The first prayer is, Father, save me from this hour, very much along the lines of what he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember, we talked about the NIV has that down as a question, but it probably is more of a request, prayer. And then, so that's prayer number 1. And then prayer number 2 is, Father, glorify your name. We kind of talked about how Jesus is stuck between a rock and a hard place. One being that he doesn't, as a true human being, he really doesn't want to undergo the suffering of his hour. But on the other hand, as the true Son of God, sent by God to accomplish the world's salvation, he wants nothing more than to do the will of the Father, even if it means enduring the suffering of his hour. And so that second petition, Father, glorify your name, kind of ends up being the lead petition. It kind of ends up being where Jesus settles. And that petition, that second petition, is literally answered from heaven. God literally speaks from heaven. So we read, then a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And then in verse 29, we get this little note that the crowd who was there didn't understand what God said. So some people thought that it had thundered. Some people think that an angel spoke. But the key thing to note is that they didn't understand what it was that God said. Only Jesus understood what it was that God said. Now, everybody who was there kind of understood that God spoke, or that something happened. Something unique or something out of the ordinary happened. But Jesus is the only one who actually understands the words that God speaks. And the reason that's important to remember is because what Jesus is going to say in verse 30 is quite surprising in the light of verse 29. Right? So in verse 29, where God speaks and we're told nobody really understood what it was or what he'd said. And then Jesus says in verse 30, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. You might think, well, how would a voice that spoke words that nobody but Jesus understood be for not his benefit, but for the benefit of the crowds? Again, this is one of those things that unfortunately a lot of commentators who don't have a very high view of the Bible will kind of see this as an inconsistency in John's gospel. That in one verse, he says that nobody understood the message from God. In the next verse, we have Jesus saying, well, this was for your benefit and not for mine. And John can't even get his story straight from one verse to another. So we're going to talk about that. Why would Jesus have said that to the crowds after God speaks this kind of miraculous promise that he is going to that he has glorified his name and he will glorify it again? And the The first thing that we'll bring up again is just this Semitic idiom. Remember this Semitic idiom that we talked about a couple weeks ago? It's very common in the Gospels, especially in the words of Jesus, where a contrast is set up, what an absolute contrast between two things is set up as a way to emphasize that one thing is more the case than the other thing. And the very famous example that we used is in Matthew's Gospel when Jesus says, unless you hate your father and mother, your son or daughter, your husband and wife, you are not worthy of me. Of course, we mean it isn't true that Jesus wants us to hate our mother and father, or son and daughter, or husband and wife. There's a whole commandment, there are whole two commandments about the fact that we should love those people. But the point is that if you have to choose between Jesus and your family, if you're going to draw an absolute distinction between the two, then you have to choose Jesus. If it's those two things, then you have to choose to love Jesus instead of your family. Or another example is in Romans, I believe it's Romans 9, where Paul quotes the Old Testament and says, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Which is a passage that bothers a lot of people because, well, I thought God loved everybody. And here's God saying that he hates Esau. But this is that same Semitic idiom, that it's an absolute difference, love and hate, that is meant to show that that God chose Jacob and not Esau. Not that he hated Esau, but it's this idea of setting up the choice of God in these absolute terms. So when Jesus says in this very absolute way, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. This is probably the Semitic idiom that really means this voice was more for your benefit than for mine. In other words, I don't think that we have to read verse 30 and come away thinking that Jesus received absolutely no benefit from hearing the Father speak what he spoke, or that he spoke at all. But what Jesus is going to say, and what he's going to unpack in these next few verses, is how that those words from heaven are more for the crowd's sake than they are for his. Okay, so it's one of those absolute, setting up an absolute in order to emphasize the greater of one of two choices. All right, so that's number one. Number two, strictly speaking, Jesus didn't need to hear the Father speak this promise, this response to his prayer, right? In other words, Jesus had already resolved at this point that even though as a human being he didn't necessarily want to suffer the pain of his hour, that he is so interested or so dedicated, so committed to glorifying God's name that he's going to do that even though it means going through the pain of his hour. He doesn't really need God to say, oh, I have glorified it and I will glorify it again. So in that sense, it's not really for Jesus' benefit that he hears the voice. It's not that the voice suddenly makes Jesus committed to honoring God's name. He was already committed to doing that. And then number three, and maybe this is the most important one, is that even if the message of the voice was not heard or understood at that time, I'm sure that it would have been a great comfort to his disciples, or to the crowds, his believing crowds anyway, who would have remembered this event after the passion and after the resurrection. In other words, it's one of those things. But later on, they did understand the significance of it. So the one that comes to my mind is in John chapter 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple and he says to the temple leaders, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it again. And they kind of scoff and say, hey, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it again in 3 days? And then the evangelist puts this little sidebar in that the temple that Jesus was talking about was his body. And after his resurrection, his disciples remembered that he had said this and they put their faith in him. So it could be that when Jesus says this voice was for your benefit, not for mine, it's because he really has in mind the benefit that his disciples and the believing people among the crowd are going to reap from the fact that God spoke. As they need to be comforted after Jesus' passion, suffering, and death, and they remember God actually speaking to Jesus, that being a comfort that they might receive. And then number 4, just the fact that God would speak from heaven. This is a very rare thing that God speaks from heaven. Even in the Old Testament, it's a very rare thing. It's only happened twice during Jesus' ministry. It happened once at his baptism, when he says, "This is my son whom I love, listen to him." And then it happened again at the Transfiguration, where God the Father says the exact same thing. So Jesus, the beginning and the ending of Jesus' public ministry are bookended by this voice from heaven. And so again, even if you didn't understand the words, which it seems the crowds didn't, even if you didn't understand the words, they did understand that something out of the ordinary happened, something unique. This is a monumental moment when Jesus realizes that with the request of the Greeks that his hour has come. This is a monumental moment in salvation history, to the point that God decides to speak from heaven, something he only does at monumental moments in salvation history. So I think these are all 4 of these are true. They're all true at the same time. This is what it means when Jesus says, "This voice was for your benefit, not for mine." It isn't that it wasn't for Jesus' benefit at all, but it was more for the crowd's benefit, as they are reminded this is a watershed moment in salvation history, and that this would be something that would comfort them in the midst of their suffering, in the midst of their doubts and their worries, as they see their Savior be betrayed and crucified and die. Okay? But it's really going to be, the rest of this little section, 31 to 33, is going to be Jesus unpacking the meaning of this idea that it's more for your benefit that God the Father speaks these things. So what we want to do now is move on to verses 31 to 33. These are very famous verses in John's Gospel. Maybe not so much in the church. I'm not sure. It probably comes up once every 3 years, a lectionary. So it's probably not as famous as John 3:16 or John 20 or anything like that. But these are verses that have been much discussed, both in the church and in the academy. Exactly what Jesus means by these things. And he's going to list 5 different things. Why is this a watershed moment in the history of salvation history? And he's going to go through a list of 5 different things. What we just want to do is we want to make sure that we understand what Jesus is saying with each of those 5 things. So, verses 31 to 33. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. Okay, so I just have a note there, kind of in the middle of page 3, that the movement of this section is important. Okay, and I know we've emphasized this many times, but just a really quick review. These Greek people, probably Greek non-Jewish believers, right? Greek-speaking believers, they hear that Jesus has preached to the cleansing of the temple, that the temple is to be a place of prayer for all nations. They're intrigued by that, so they ask if they can have an audience with Jesus. Jesus hears about this request for an audience, and he recognizes it as a sign from heaven, as a sign from his Father, that the hour that he has been talking about throughout the gospel is drawing very close, that he does really expect this to be the last week of his life. This makes him very troubled in his soul. As a real human being, he doesn't necessarily desire to go through the suffering of this hour. And yet, nevertheless, he resolves to do whatever it takes to glorify God's name, right? And then that resolve leads to God speaking this voice from heaven, confirming his request. So we've seen all these things happen, but I guess the paramount or the quintessential Lutheran question is, so what? What does this mean? Okay, so what is the significance of all this movement? Where is it going, right? Where is this whole section that we've been talking about since verse 20 headed? And the answer is it's headed here. It's headed to verses 31 and 32. Okay, and so these really, in a real way, these verses unpack the whole meaning of this entire section. And as I said, there are 5 different emphases, and they're all connected to this fusing together of the ideas of Jesus' suffering and his glorification. So remember, we said earlier in this section, Jesus uses the term lifted up in a twofold way, or he used the term the Son of Man in a twofold way, both to emphasize his being lifted up on a cross, his suffering, and to emphasize him being lifted up or raised up on the 3rd day, or maybe on the 40th day, his ascension into heaven, raised up to this position of glory and power. They're both true at the same time, right? Or the Son of Man. He is both, he has the frailty of a real human being, but he's also this great, tremendous king from Daniel 7, who receives from the Ancient of Days a kingdom that is universal and eternal. Right? So in John's Gospel, the lifting up and the terms the Son of Man are true in multiple ways, in 2 ways at once. And so what Jesus is doing is kind of unpacking that intentional ambiguity with these 5 emphases. Okay? So the first one, he says that his passion and glorification, so both being lifted up on the cross and then being raised up to heaven or ascending up to heaven, that marks the time for judgment on this world. Now, that term, judgment, can mean a couple different things. It can be either bad or it can be good. If the judgment is bad, then you might translate it something like condemnation. And if the judgment is good, it might be something like justification, or or the gift of righteousness, or something like that. And so normally we think about those things, God declaring the world, or the people of the world, either just or unjust, righteous or unrighteous, or innocent or guilty. We normally think about that as being a last day kind of thing, which is why in modern English, a lot of times we call it Judgment Day. It's the day that God is going to render his judgment, or at least the day he's going to make that judgment public. But with this statement, when Jesus says, now is the time for judgment in this world, he is letting us know that this event, or the coming of his hour, is going to be the basis on which the announcements of Judgment Day are going to be made. This is one of the big themes of John's Gospel, and it's really a big theme in Paul's letters, that the last day, or the glory of the last day, is already breaking into the present evil age. That we don't have to wait for the last day to find out what our judgment is going to be. We need just look at the cross to find out what our judgment is going to be. The hour of judgment for the world, whether righteous or unrighteous, whether faithful or wicked, is decided at the cross. The cross is the dividing line in humanity. There's only 2 kinds of people, believers and unbelievers, the righteous and the wicked, those who are justified and those who are condemned. And so Jesus is saying that, well, that thing that you normally think about is only happening on Judgment Day. That is actually going to be introduced right now, in this hour, with the coming of my suffering, death / glorification. The 2 are inseparably fused together. Okay? The second one is, I guess I just have here, draw all people to himself, and it is in the gospel sense, in the sense that Jesus dies for the sins of the whole world. So in that sense, he draws all people to himself. This isn't a statement that literally all people are going to be saved, right? There are all kinds of statements in the Bible that make it clear that even though Jesus dies for the world, not everyone in the world is saved. So when he talks about drawing all people to himself, He is talking about in a gospel sense or in an objective justification sense. Okay, and then on the top of page 4, just to point out that there's a little bit of irony here, a classical Johannine irony. When Jesus says that he will die or he will be lifted up, both on the cross and to heaven, to draw the whole world to himself. There's irony there because remember that in John's gospel, the world is used to denote the world as it stands in opposition to God, the fallen world. It isn't just a neutral term in John's gospel. Well, okay, it's the world, it's everybody. But when for example, in John chapter 3, when he says, "For God so loved the world," he's saying that God loved the world that had rebelled against him. It's kind of the point that Paul makes in Romans when he says, "While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." That God didn't wait for us to become good people before he started loving us. He started loving us. And by faith in his son, we become good people. This is what I'm kind of pointing out, that this idea of judging the world, whether you're justifying the world or condemning the world, is significant or ironic because of the connotation that the word world has in the fourth gospel. Okay, so that's emphasis number 1. Now the time of judgment has come to the world. And then number 2, now the prince of this world, which is literally the ruler of this world, will be driven, or is driven out, will be driven out. Now there are 2 other times in John's gospel where the devil is called the prince, the ruler of this world. And Paul will use that term as well in 2 Corinthians 4 and twice in Ephesians. It's also used many, many times in the intertestamental Jewish literature. In other words, there were 400 years between Malachi and John the Baptist, but it wasn't that all Jewish people stopped writing in those 400 years. They continued to write works. They just weren't inspired by God. And in that intertestamental period, Jewish literature began to use this particular phrase to describe the devil, the ruler or the prince of this world. This maybe helps us a little bit to think about the third temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, when the devil says to Jesus, "Well, bow down and worship me, and I will give you all the kingdoms of the world." The reason, of course, this is a temptation is because Jesus has come to rescue the world from domination of the devil, right? And so the devil is actually saying to Jesus, "Well, if you just bow down and worship me, then I'll just let you have your mission. Your mission will be complete. You won't have to go to the cross. You won't have to suffer. You won't have to die. You will have rescued the world from me just by bowing down to worship me. You won't have to go through the pain and suffering of the cross." So that temptation really only makes sense if we think about the world literally being under the domination, being slaves of the devil. So it is true in a sense that he is the prince of this world, as long as we understand it's not absolutely true, that God never loses his sovereignty. He never stopped being the king of the world. He never loses control of the world to the devil. But there is a real sense in which the world, because of the fall and the sin, the world is the devil's plaything. He wields great influence. So when Jesus says that the prince of this world will be driven out, he is talking about the devil. He's going to overcome the devil. The devil will be victorious over the devil. Now, of course, there's a sense in which that had already happened. Really, that already happened in Genesis chapter 3. Right? The devil thought that he had beaten God by tempting the crown of God's creation into sinning. But then God responds with the very first gospel promise, that the seed of the woman will crush your head. Yes, you will strike his heel, but you're going to crush his head. So there's a sense in which the victory over the devil already happened in the Garden of Eden. And of course, there's a sense in which the ultimate victory over the devil won't happen until the last day. So that even though the devil was defeated at the cross, or even though the devil was overthrown in the Garden of Eden, he continues to have this kind of kamikaze type of plan that he knows he's going to lose, but he's going to take out as many as possible. He's going to take out as many with him as he possibly can. And in that sense, he still wields a tremendous amount of influence over the people of this world. But really what we want to see, the most important thing is, remember, Jesus says this hour. When he talks about this hour, he's talking about his being lifted up on the cross and him being lifted up or glorified into heaven. And so what he's saying is the past victory of the defeat of the devil and the future victory of the defeat of the devil is all centered on this moment, his crucifixion and his exaltation. The only reason that the devil was overthrown in Genesis 3, and the only reason he will be overthrown on the last day is because of what Jesus accomplishes on the cross. And so in that sense, he can say about his cross, his being lifted up on the cross and his glorification, that this is the hour when the devil is driven out. Okay? So I have a question here from Roberta. So how does this meld with the Apostles' book of Revelation, judgment of this world and the prince being driven out? Are both pictures of Revelation? Is this another way to view how time in heaven isn't the same as time on earth? So first of all, I just say, certainly this is a very good point, that this is all language that's appropriated in the book of Revelation. And what I would just remind you of is that the guy who wrote the book of Revelation is the same guy who wrote this gospel, right? And so this happens a lot, actually, even to the point that there are some scholars who suggest that the book of John was the last book that John wrote, that Revelation came first. Now, I don't really think that's true. I think it's pretty clear that Revelation was the last book that he wrote, and that the Gospel is probably the first book. But nevertheless, it really isn't that crazy an idea, because so many of the Gospel's themes reappear in the book of Revelation. So in that part of your question, Robert, I would completely and utterly agree. A lot of these same images and these themes are going to be reappropriated in the last book that John writes. I'm not sure, though, that I would attribute that to the timelessness of heaven. First of all, because I'm not so convinced that heaven is timeless. I do think that there will be time in heaven, but in the sense that God is outside of time, right? So God is not subject to time in the same way that we are or even will be in heaven. So in that sense, God can speak in the book of Isaiah of the work of Jesus in the past tense. He, was crushed for our transgressions. The punishment that we deserved was on him, and by his wounds we were healed. Those are all past tense verbs. And the reason that God can speak of Jesus' future work in the past tense is because God is outside of time. For God, it's all one moment. It's all just an eternal present. Instead, what I'd say, the reason we see these themes reappearing in the book of Revelation is because Revelation is not so much about what's going to happen on the last day, as much as it's about what's going on right now. It's an important thing to remember about Revelation is what is being revealed. Because sometimes we're tricked into thinking that the book of Revelation is only, some people say only, but if not only, then mostly about what's going to happen in the very end of world history. And while it is true that there are some verses in the book of Revelation that are about what's going to happen at the end of world history, the reality is that most of the book of Revelation is about what's going on right now and what has been going on since Jesus' cross and glorification. And so, in a sense, I'd say what we see, the reappropriation of this language in Revelation, is really nothing more than the continued application of the meaning of Christ being lifted up, both on the cross and to heaven. And that the meaning of that event, or those events that continue throughout the New Testament era. And so it's something like, because on the cross the devil is driven out, so too throughout the New Testament era the devil is being driven out. And that will culminate at a final being driven out on the last day. Or because in the lifting up of Jesus on the cross or to heaven, judgment comes on this world, whether righteous or unrighteous, whether faith or unbelief, condemnation or justification, whatever it is, that judgment has come upon the world in the moment of Jesus' cross and resurrection and glorification. But it also continues to come over and over again as people either believe the gospel or reject it. Right? And that will happen throughout the New Testament era until the very last day, when there will be a public, universally made known judgment about believers and unbelievers, righteous and unrighteous, justification and condemnation. So I think you're very right to identify the connection between the two. I'm not so sure that I would say the reason is because heaven is timeless. There's been a great discussion about this, a long discussion about this in the Lutheran Fathers, and you have different Lutheran theologians who have understood it different ways. Luther, and sometimes in Luther's writing, he seems to give the impression that he believes that heaven is timeless, and other times in Luther's writings, he very clearly gives the impression that he doesn't think it's timeless. And that's maybe the danger of writing as much as Luther did, that you're bound to contradict yourself at some time or another. It's why it really bothers me that all of these videos are online for you to go back and check later. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter whether heaven is timeless or not. It's an interesting theological discussion to have, but really, all we need to know about heaven is how to get there, right? The only thing we really need to know about heaven is to make sure that we end up there, and that's through faith in Jesus. Exactly how the details are going to work out. If I'm wrong about there being time in heaven, I'm not going to feel really bad about that because I'll be in heaven, right? So yeah, thank you for that question and that thought. It's very good. It's very appropriate for us to be reminded of the connection between John's Gospel and the book of Revelation. It is a vital connection. All right, so that's number 2. Let's move on to number 3. So emphasis number 3, that the suffering glorification of Jesus is really the same thing as Jesus being lifted up. Now, we've already seen this very famously in John 3. Right? When Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that whoever looks to him in faith will be saved. Right? So we've already heard this analogy before. The reason that I bring this up, though, unfortunately, the NIV 84 makes an inexcusable mistake with this third emphasis. It is fixed in the NIV 2011. But the NIV 84 says, but, at the beginning of this phrase. So the NIV 84 says something like, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. As if this third line is something different than the first 2 lines. And it isn't. And there's nothing in the Greek text that would make you think that it's different. The NIV 2011 is totally correct by changing the word but into and. And. So now judgment on this world has come. Now the prince of this world is being driven out. And now with my suffering, with my being lifted up and being glorified, I'm going to draw all people to myself. Okay, so it's really 3 ways or 3 different aspects of this one same event. This twofold being lifted up, both on the cross and into heaven. And so just, you want to mention that if you continue to use 1984, which is just fine, it's a great translation. It's still kind of my preferred translation. It's just not what I use anymore. Maybe just take a pen, mark through the word and, the but, and write the word and there. Maybe make a marginal note. NIV translators blow it, read and instead of but, or something like that. Just so that, when you come back to this verse later, you're not fooled by that adversative particle instead of what should really be a conjunctive particle. Okay, but I guess the other point I've already made this point tonight, so I'll just go over it just really briefly, is that we shouldn't separate the suffering of Jesus from the glorification of Jesus, as if the suffering of Jesus is nothing more than a preliminary step to the glorification of Jesus. Now, of course, it is that, right? In order to be glorified, in a sense of to be risen from the dead and to ascend into heaven, he must first die. You can't rise from the grave until you die. So there is a sense in which his being lifted up on the cross is preliminary to his being raised from the dead and going up into heaven. But remember that in John's gospel, especially, those two ideas of suffering and glorification are fused together so that they cannot be separated. One implies and entails the other. So that in a very real way in John's gospel, Jesus being lifted up on the cross is his glory. He doesn't have to wait for the resurrection or the ascension into heaven for him to be glorified. In John's gospel, the two are so intimately connected that you can look at the cross and you can see Jesus suffering and say, there the glory of Jesus is being revealed. And this is just what I find so fascinating about the fourth gospel, is that it so powerfully and so beautifully illustrates that God's kingdom is an upside down kingdom. We talked about this last week, this whole thing about the cross, the theology of the cross, that God's grace or God's justification comes through condemnation, and his acceptance comes through somebody's rejection, right? Or the beauty of the gospel only comes after the harsh preaching of the law. This is just the way that God's kingdom works. It's upside down. It goes against everything we would expect as human beings. It's a theology of the cross, not a theology of glory. And just we see all that coming out again here in the third idea. All right, then number 4, so the top of page 5 now. Number 4, Jesus says that his suffering and glorification will draw all people to himself. Remember that this phrase, to draw to the Father, was used very significantly in John chapter 6, in the Bread of Life discourse, where Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. Okay, so this is an important reminder or important theological treatment that reminds us not to believe in Arminianism, not to believe that we make a decision for Jesus, right? It's not that we decide to be believers, because it's only possible to be a believer if the Father draws you to Jesus. Our conversion is a divine work in us, not a human work that we contribute to. I think that the interesting thing, though, the contrast, the difference between Jesus' use of this word in John 6 and his use of the word in John 12 is that his use of the word in John 6 is very much about subjective justification. There's no single individual who is able to come to the Father or come to Jesus, believe in Jesus, unless the Father draws him. So, of course, there are going to be many people who aren't going to come to Jesus because they refuse to be drawn to him by the work of the Father. But here, when he makes it universal, he's going to draw all people to himself. He's going to draw the world to himself. He's not talking in terms of subjective justification, but in terms of objective justification. That when he's lifted up on the cross, he's not just suffering to pay for the sins of believers. He's not just suffering to pay for the sins of some people in the world. He's suffering to pay for all people's sins, for the sins of the whole world. In other words, if a person isn't saved, it's not because God didn't want them. It's not because Jesus didn't draw them. It's because they refused to be drawn. It is objectively true that Jesus draws the whole world to himself. That as he's lifted up on the cross, he redeems, he justifies the whole world. You are declared not guilty whether you believe in Jesus or not. And you and I were declared not guilty centuries before we were even born, millennia before we were even born. And yet we also know that doesn't mean the whole world is going to be saved. And so in John 6, we have the idea of being drawn to Jesus in a very individual, subjective sense. Here in John 12, we have it in a very universal or objective sense. Okay, and of course that kind of makes sense that we would see it in this objective sense here as Jesus understands the coming of the Greeks as a signal that his hour, or the culmination of his whole ministry, is about to arrive. Right? So only a difference in perspective. And then number 5, the dramatic development And notice this has happened twice. It happens twice, and then in some ways 3 times because he connects the first two with the word and, not but and, right? So Jesus emphasizes twice, now, now, okay? Very important, kind of a very startling adverb. Now, because again, these are a lot of these things are things we would expect to come later, that we would expect to come at the last day. So not only does this paragraph serve to tie back to what comes earlier. Remember, what comes earlier is the Greeks ask to see Jesus, and Jesus recognizes this as a sign from heaven that something significant is about to happen. Well, here is the significant thing that's about to happen. The judgment is going to be brought on the world. The prince of this world is going to be driven out, and the whole world's going to be drawn to Jesus. That's all. Just that. Just the culmination of world history. That's all that's going to happen now, at this moment, right? But not only does it do that, but it also emphasizes that this moment, this being lifted up on the cross and then being exalted or glorified into heaven, it really is the culmination of world history. It's the culmination of salvation history. It's the culmination of Jesus' ministry. It is the fulcrum on which the history of the world turns. It is the deciding moment in the battle against evil. It is the moment in which you are saved in a very real way. And so by emphasizing this idea with the repetition of the word now, Jesus is emphasizing that what we might expect or what we do look to be happening in the future is really based on or established the work that he's doing at this moment with the completion of his hour. All right, I know that was long. That was 42 minutes of going straight. So any other questions or comments or concerns or questions about verses 30 to 33? 30 to 33. John.
Could you explain what you mean by when you said that you're not sure heaven is timeless?
Okay, so John's question is about the kind of sidetrack that we took there in Revelation. Will there be time in heaven or not? This is a discussion that people have been arguing for centuries, that even Lutherans have been arguing for centuries. Here are the two arguments, okay? So the one argument that there will be no time in heaven is the argument that says that we will be with God in heaven, and God transcends time. God is outside of time. So if God is outside of time, and we're going to be with God, thus, we must be outside of time too. So there's some people who want to argue that eternal life is not, it's not just life that keeps going and going and going and going and going. It's not Energizer Bunny life, right? That it's actually transcending time. That there will be no more time. That we will live in an eternal present when we get to heaven. Because for God, everything is an eternal present. We'll be with God. Okay? That is the argument for timelessness in heaven. And I can't disprove that argument. It is a perfectly rational, logical, meaningful argument. However, I think there are little hints that even in heaven there will be time. The biggest one, the verse that really convinces me is the book of Revelation. John sees a vision of the beheaded souls of the martyrs gathered underneath the altar of God. And they are crying out, "How long, O Lord, how long until you judge the earth?" Now, these saints, these martyrs, are literally in heaven. John literally sees them in heaven. And yet they are in heaven crying out, "Hey, can we please get on with the judging thing? Can we get vengeance on the people who cut our heads off? We'd like to see that process sped up, please." Right? Because they are still experiencing time. Even though they're in heaven and they don't necessarily know everything that's going on the world, they do know that last day hasn't come yet. You're going to know that because your body and your soul are going to be put back together. It's going to be pretty obvious that the last day has come, because you're going to be existing in heaven only as a soul, and then all of a sudden you're going to be on the new heavens and the new earth, both body and soul. Right? And so that verse, maybe something like when Jesus says, I have long desired to eat this supper with you, and I will not eat or drink of this cup again until I eat and drink it anew in the kingdom. Now that verse maybe doesn't prove it one way or another, but the idea of until or again really doesn't mean anything in a timeless situation. There is no again or then in a timeless situation, because everything is an eternal present, right? The word again means nothing in the eternal present. You can't have anything again in the eternal present, because everything is the eternal present. And if that makes your head hurt, good, because it kind of makes my head hurt too. It's one of the things that makes this whole picturing eternity thing so difficult. So, if you believe that heaven is going to be timeless, there are all kinds of very strong Lutheran dogmaticians that you can cite as proof that you are teaching the Lutheran teaching. And if you believe that there is time in heaven, there are all kind of other very famous, very strong, faithful Lutheran dogmaticians who would support what you teach as well. And ultimately, we won't know until we get there, right? We won't find out till we get there. What I would say is this: if we get to heaven, and it turns out that there is time, you just take a look over at me, and I'll give you a little wink. See, I told you so. I told you there was going to be time, right? Okay, all right. So, you have a question?
Well, I was going to say, can you just distinguish between what you mean by timelessness in heaven and then the eternity that will be in heaven?
Yeah. So Rachel's question is, what is the difference between timelessness and eternity? For God, there is no difference. Okay, but remember that God's eternity is not like our eternity. God is eternal in a way that we are not. When we use that word eternal to describe God, think back to your catechism class now, however many years ago that was. When we talk about the eternity of God, we're saying that he has no beginning and he has no end. There was never a time when God was not. If you're ever having trouble sleeping, then try to make your mind think about what was there before there was God. And I promise you that you'll be asleep before you figure it out. Okay? Because it's impossible for us to wrap our minds around the idea of a being who has no beginning. We live in a universe that runs on the basis of cause and effect. And so the idea that there is a being who has no cause, who has just always been, is something we can't even imagine. It's something beyond our ability to fathom. But when we talk about our lives being eternal, we're really only talking about it being eternal in one direction, right? We have not always been. We will always be. Once you start being, you will always be, either in heaven or in hell, but you will always be. And so, because of these kind of two different meanings of the word eternal, the sense in which God is eternal is not the same in the sense that we will have eternal life. Because God has no beginning, has no end. We will only have no end. It can get tricky if you're talking about eternity. Is eternity timeless or not? Well, it depends on for whose perspective you're looking at. From God's perspective, eternity is timeless. From our perspective, I don't think it's timeless, though I could be wrong. So that's kind of what we mean by it. It's again, if this makes your head hurt, or if this all sounds like nonsense that's not worth talking about, it probably isn't. It's just the kind of things that theologians like to argue about. So don't worry about it. Whatever it is in heaven will be great. You'll think it's wonderful. Okay, so don't be troubled by this at all. But that's kind of the discussion that people have about what exactly is heaven going to be like. There's so much that we don't know. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the last part of the lesson that is printed today, verses 34 and 36 through 36. You might say, Pastor, maybe you're trying to be a little annoying now by having such a lesson on a short set of verses. And that may be true. But the reason is because these last three verses really are the end of this section. Okay? the section that goes all the way back to verse 20 with the appearance of these Greeks really comes to a close here in verse 36. And verse 37 is going to introduce something, it's not, I don't want to say it's completely new because it's obviously related, but it is a new section. It's a new thing. Jesus isn't speaking anymore. John the evangelist is speaking, beginning in verse 37. Okay? So these last three verses of this section, or this little paragraph here, are really the conclusion of this whole section that we've been talking about for like a month now, that began back with the appearance of the Greeks asking for their audience to see Jesus. Okay? So we'll start with verse 34. The crowd spoke up. We have heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? All right, now there's a lot of interesting things going on here. The first thing, there are a lot of commentators, again, interpreters who have a very low view of the Bible, who don't necessarily believe the Bible is inspired and inerrant, and who actually tend to think there are all kinds of mistakes in the Bible, and their job as interpreters is to find those mistakes. A lot of those kind of interpreters will say that the crowds are misquoting Jesus. Jesus never said the Son of Man will be lifted up. He says that when I am lifted up. Okay? And so there are some people who say this is, John can't get his story straight. You know, John, is it Jesus that's going to be lifted up, or is it the Son of Man that's going to be lifted up? And he can't decide. John can't decide. Hopefully you can see why that's a very stupid argument, because you can go back to earlier in this section and you can see that Jesus is talking about himself as the Son of Man. In other words, it is true that the crowds are making a deduction. Something goes something like this. Jesus claims to be the Son of Man. The Son of Man must be lifted up. Thus, Jesus must be lifted up, or something along those lines. And not only is that a reasonable conclusion to reach. What would be much more unreasonable is to think that the crowds would never have gotten there, right? That the crowds can't even put together this idea that Jesus is connecting himself to the title, the Son of Man. So there's no contradiction here at all. There is no difference between Jesus saying, when I am lifted up, and the crowd saying the Son of Man is lifted up. Because everybody knows that Jesus is talking about himself when he says the Son of Man. All right, the other interesting thing, or the second interesting thing, is that they immediately connect this phrase, the Son of Man, to the Messiah, right? So they heard that Jesus has said when the Son of Man is lifted up, right? But they see it from the law, the Messiah will reign forever. So we see that these crowds are connecting the concepts of the Son of Man with the concept of the Messiah. That too isn't at all surprising, because any Jew who has ever read Daniel chapter 7 knows that the Son of Man is a messianic title. It is a title that refers especially to the role or the office of Messiah as king. He enters the presence of the Ancient of Days and he receives a kingdom that has no boundaries and has no end. So remember, the term Messiah, or Christ, means the anointed one. The Messiah has three aspects: his office as prophet, priest, and king. And Daniel chapter 7 shows us the messianic aspect of Jesus as king. So that when Jesus invokes that term, the Son of Man, by invoking Daniel 7, he's calling himself a king, the messianic king. And again, it isn't unreasonable to think that the crowds have made this connection. It would be unreasonable to think that they didn't make this connection. Okay? Everybody understands what Jesus is saying about himself when he says, I am the Son of Man. What they don't get, what the crowds don't understand, is how can Jesus be the Messiah if he's going to die? Because remember, in their minds, the Messiah is only a great conquering, victorious king. The thought that the Messiah should suffer and die has never entered their minds. The fact that the Messiah might suffer and die kind of seems like opposite of what the Messiah should do to them. To them, the Messiah is going to remain forever. Now, notice that they say that we've heard this from the law, capital L, law. Okay, and so when you see that word law in the New Testament, it can mean three different things, but usually it means one of two different things. Usually, it means the Mosaic law, the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, the Mosaic law. This is how John uses it in the prologue. In John chapter 1, he says, something comes through the law, but grace and peace come through Jesus Christ, right? So he's contrasting, I forget what the first part is, but he's contrasting the blessings that came to God's people through the Mosaic law with the even greater blessings that come to God's people through Jesus, okay? So he's contrasting Jesus with Moses there in the prologue.
The law was given through Moses.
Oh, yeah, the law was given through Moses. So that's obviously the law, the Mosaic law, right? The law is given through Moses, but grace and peace come through Christ Jesus. So he's not saying that the law, the Mosaic law, is bad. It was itself a blessing. It's just that there are greater blessings that come through Jesus. Or to say it in my annoyingly repetitive way, Moses is a type of Christ, right? And the Mosaic law pointed ahead to something greater and something better, the new covenant, or the Jesus' covenant. Okay, anyway, let's not take that detour. So it can be used that way, as we refer to the Mosaic law. It can also be, though, a way of referring to the entirety of what we would call the Old Testament. Okay? And John has used it this way, too. In John chapter 8, Jesus quotes Psalm 82. And he says, if the law says, and then he quotes Psalm 82. Well, of course, Psalm 82 is not in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, because Psalm 82 is in the book of Psalms. And so it can't be, Jesus can't be using the word law there to refer only to the Mosaic law. He must be referring it to the entire, at least what we would call the Old Testament scriptures. Now I have a little footnote there about, just realize that when we say that a believer, or that Old Testament believer knew the Old Testament scriptures, that they would never have thought of it that way. They didn't know an Old Testament. There wasn't any such thing until there was a New Testament. Right? And so this whole idea of having 2 parts of the Bible is a completely Christian New Testament reality. That nobody in the Gospels, including Jesus himself, would have talked that way. They would never have talked about the books of Moses through Malachi as being the old anything. Because that's just the testament that they had. Those are the scriptures. Now, from our perspective, we can call it the Old Testament or the Old Covenant because we've seen the enactment of the New Testament or the New Covenant. Right? But there's a very famous, very conservative scholar who kind of, in all of his, he's kind of annoying about it. In all of his writings, he talks about how, can we please stop calling it the Old and New Testament? Because, of course, this kind of gives people the wrong impression about the relationship between the two. He thinks, he always contends, and in his writing he always calls them the First and Second Testaments. The First and Second Testaments. And again, I think he maybe has a point. On the other hand, you're not going to overturn 2,000 years of church history by, we're stuck with those terms, Old and New Testament. We just realize that when we talk about the Jews thinking about the Old Testament, they would never have thought about it as the Old Testament. They would have just thought about it as the Bible. Okay? That was their Bible. What we call the Old Testament was their Bible. That was the scriptures. Until the New Testament gets written. Okay, so this is my little point, the little footnote that I have written there. And I'm actually going to stop right there. So in other words, we've said what the crowds do understand. They do understand that Jesus is claiming to be the Son of Man, and they do understand that it's a messianic claim. What they don't understand is how Jesus can be both the Messiah and die. So if you want to find out how the Paul Harvey part of the story, the rest of the story, then you got to join us again next week. We'll explain where this confusion comes from and how it shows that the crowds still have a long way to go. So we'll do that. And we'll finish this little section, and God willing, we'll start the next section, which is a little theological meditation. John's, the evangelist's theological meditation on the meaning of Jewish unbelief. It's a fascinating little set of paragraphs. And so we'll launch into that next week too, God willing. So hopefully you're able to join us again next week. Thank you for joining us this week, or if you're watching this, the catalog version, then certainly thank you for taking the time. God's richest blessings to you, and let's close with the blessing. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us always. Amen. God's blessings, everyone.